So I would now like to take the opportunity to welcome Dr. Jeremy Maron, who will introduce the film, The Garden of the Finzi-Continis.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming here today to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights for one of the events being organized for this year's International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I'd like to reiterate Amber's thanks for our partners on these programs, and I want to give a special thanks to Belle Jarneski and Stan Carboni for asking me to speak today, and of course all of you for coming. The focus of this year's programming for International Holocaust Remembrance Day is on the history of the Holocaust as it pertains to the Italian experience, and more particularly, the Italian Jewish experience, corresponding with Italy being the host country for this year's plenaries of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and also the 80th anniversary of the institution in Italy of the anti-Semitic racial laws in 1938 by Mussolini's fascist regime. This focus on the historical context of the Holocaust in Italy offers an opportunity for us to reflect on a particular history of the Holocaust that is less well known than some of its other components, such as the Nuremberg Laws or Kristallnacht in Nazi Germany, the mobile killing squads of Eastern Europe, or the death camps. It was only around the mid-1980s that this particular national history in relation to the Holocaust began to attract more widespread attention in Holocaust scholarship and in popular representation. And as I will discuss, there is an argument to be made that it is the particular qualities of the Holocaust as it manifested in Italy and the cultural memory of this history that informed an initial tendency to overlook or downplay the Italian Holocaust experience and delayed a concerted academic interest in this particular history. The film we are going to screen shortly, The Garden of the Finzi-Continis, was released in 1970. It offers a provocative means for considering such questions of memory and history as they pertain to the Holocaust in Italy. The film explores the experiences of Italian Jews during the Holocaust through a focus on two families in Ferrara, the aristocratic Finzi-Continis and the upper bourgeois family of the film's protagonist, Giorgio, whose lives are increasingly impacted by the growing anti-Semitism in fascist Italy after the implementation of the racial laws and after the alliance between Nazi Germany and fascist Italy that saw Italy formally enter the Second World War in 1940. The film is an adaptation of Giorgio Bassani's 1962 novel of the same name. Giorgio Bassani being a very well-known Italian Jewish writer who was active in the anti-fascist movement and was briefly arrested as a dissident shortly before Italy's 1943 surrender to the Allies. After fleeing to Florence with his wife and with forged passports, Bassani was able to rescue his sister and his parents, while the rest of his family from Ferrara was killed in the Holocaust, victims of the deportations that began once Mussolini's successor, Pietro Badoglio, surrendered to the Allies in 1943, an immediate consequence being that Nazi Germany, forces of whom were already present in Italy as part of the Axis alliance, occupied the northern and central parts of the country, establishing the puppet regime of the Italian Social Republic, aka the Republic of Salo, with Mussolini still as its titular head, but with all meaningful power now in the hands of the occupying Nazi forces. And it was within this post-1943 context that the deportations of Italian Jews began. At the directorial helm of the film adaptation of Bassani's novel was Vittorio De Sica, known as one of the most important filmmakers of the Italian neorealist movement of the late 1940s and early 1950s, with his films that are probably most well known, The Bicycle Thief and Umberto D, utilizing minimalist aesthetics and amateur performers as a means of offering realist consideration of pressing social issues. As will become quickly evident when we screen the film today, the opulent visuals and professional actors of The Garden of the Finzi-Continis mark a clear departure from the minimalist aesthetics of De Sica's neorealist work. But the subject matter of the film marks, in the words of film scholar Millicent Marcus, De Sica's return to a cinema of moral accountability after a series of releases in the later 1950s and 1960s that one Time critic referred to as, at best, fluff and more frequently flubs. And that's a quote from Time critic Jim Parker. In a 1971 interview, DeSica refers to a moral impulse that motivated his decision to make the film, stating, quote, "I myself feel shame because we are all guilty of the deaths of millions of Jews. Why were they killed? Because a criminal, a lunatic wanted that. But the Italian fascists are also guilty. So am I. I wasn't a fascist, but I belong to the country that collaborated with Hitler. I wanted, out of conscience, to make this film, and I am glad I made it." End quote. This moral injunction made by DeSica not only against himself, but against his country, suggests a sense of national interrogation of the past, which I'll return in greater detail to after the film. But for now, prior to the screening, it will suffice to mention that this sense of making the film as a moral response to Italy's past, and the film's content on the increasingly precarious social and political circumstances facing Italian Jews, clearly establish the Garden of the Finzi-Continis as a representation of and critical engagement with a particular national experience of the Holocaust. But this film differs strikingly from how we might be used to seeing filmic representations of the Shoah. It's a very beautiful film. It's a film that does not show violence or brutality in a way that makes it very distinct from some of the iconic, horrifying, and indeed memorable scenes of Holocaust cinema, both narrative and documentary. Moreover, it's a film that calls attention to its own beauty through its self-reflexive reference to the garden of its title, the garden of the Finzi-Continis family, a seemingly idyllic space that seems to promise a sense of refuge for the characters, a sense of refuge that they seek to enter and remain within, that seems in stark contrast to the deteriorating conditions for Italian Jews in pre-war and wartime Italy. But at the same time, the film frames this beauty as illusory. And it is precisely that perception or misrecognition of an illusory beauty as real that the film exposes as problematic and, as we will see, dangerous. And I think it is through this particular postulation of the danger of being unable or unwilling to recognize political reality for what it is that the film not only illuminates the Italian experience of the Holocaust, but also comments on the cultural memory of this history, which we'll discuss in more detail after the film and during the Q&A. But for now, let's watch this beautiful and tragic film, Vittorio De Sica's The Garden of the Finzi-Continis. Thank you. Of the specifics of the Italian history of the Holocaust, and I think also a commentary on how this history is remembered. I mentioned before the film very briefly that the Italian experience, the Italian history of the Holocaust, was one that had for many years comparatively scant attention paid to it, despite the institution of the racial laws in fascist Italy in 1938, and despite the official wartime alliance between Italy and Nazi Germany that existed from 1940 to 1943. The first academic work on the subject was published in 1961 by Renzo De Felice, the English title, History of Italian Jews Under Fascism. But the first full-length English study on the Holocaust in the Italian context was not published until 1978, a study called Mussolini and the Jews by Meyer Michaelis. And Renzo De Felice's groundbreaking study would not actually be translated into any foreign language until 2001, when an English edition was published. So the question that looms is, why was attention to this particular national history of the Holocaust so delayed? And one explanation that has been offered is that some of the very characteristics of the Holocaust as it happened in Italy, when compared to other national histories, offer an illusion of a less overtly horrific national experience of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is characterized by a concavity of mass death, mass eradication. 6 million European Jews, 2/3 of European Jewry wiped out. In the case of Italy, on the surface, the numbers almost appear as an anomaly to this attempted annihilation, as approximately 85% of Italian Jews survived the Holocaust. In Holocaust literature then, which was primarily focused on the attempted eradication of European Jewry, when the case of Italy was referred to, the emphasis was often on this high rate of survival. Other themes that were asserted included a sense that official anti-Semitism in fascist Italy was largely imposed to placate Nazi Germany, and that the anti-Semitism manifest in the racial laws was not implemented by Italian authorities or embraced by Italian citizens in the same way that the Nuremberg laws of 1935 were assiduously adhered to in Germany. Other things that were emphasized in early scholarly literature on the Holocaust in Italy emphasized examples of individuals that purposely circumvented the laws in order to give aid to Jews. So given such emphases, combined importantly with the comparatively small number of Jewish victims of the Holocaust from Italy, the scholarly consensus emerged that, this is in the words of Italian historian Susan Zuccotti, that, quote, Italian fascist persecution of Jews was not only mild, but that Mussolini, the Italian armed forces, Italian civilians, and many church officials consistently protected Jews throughout the war years, end quote. So this is Susan Zuccotti describing the scholarly emphasis that emerged, and I'm going to return to Susan Zuccotti again and her interrogation and problematizing this conception shortly. So I would argue that both when Giorgio Bassani wrote the literary version of The Garden of the Finzi-Continis in 1962, and when De Sica made this film in 1970, these works were circulating in an international context within which the Holocaust in Italy was viewed, again comparatively, as unshocking, perhaps even mild. Yet between the time of the novel's publication, 1962, and De Sica's film's release, 1970, a discursive shift had started. By 1970, there has begun in Europe a greater push towards a more critical re-examination of the past in relation to national histories during the Second World War, and critical reflection on how such histories are told or framed. For instance, national historical narratives that may have emphasized a national resistance to Nazi occupation were being skeptically revisioned as potential means of deflecting or obscuring crucial questions related to extensive national collaboration with the Nazis. This became most evident in the student protests of 1968 in Paris, but similar critical revisioning of the past was taking place elsewhere at this time as well. So when De Sica's film is released, this is a period where such national self-critique is starting to be recognized and worked through. And one can see such national interrogation very explicitly at moments that are peppered throughout the film. After Giorgio's initial argument with his father in the dining room, his assertion that we stood by silently as it wasn't happening to us implicates, of course, not only the family, but Italy as a whole, as it is an indictment of public tolerance of persecution. Italian passivity or passive complicity is also implicated when the library director kicks Giorgio out of the library, suggesting that he must follow fascist orders because he has a family. And Giorgio expands this excuse by applying it to the whole nation, saying, all Italy has a family, suggesting there will always be an excuse to look away when action is necessary. De Sica's desire to offer a critique of Italy's national past is also broadened when Giorgio was riding the train to visit his brother in France, and he overhears two Italian soldiers discussing the use of poison gas in Mussolini's 1935 invasion of Ethiopia. The shift towards national skepticism evident in the 1970 film as a marker of a particular interrogative moment becomes even more obvious when one looks at the film in relation to Bassani's 1962 novel, which, at least in my reading, is focused more on the narrator's elegiac reflection on the Finzi-Continis family and does not delve into the question of national interrogation in the same way that the film does. And even looking at Vittorio De Sica's own cinematic oeuvre, one can find a stark distinction between the critical national reflection in Finzi-Continis and one of De Sica's films from only a decade prior, Two Women, in which the presentation of Italy in relation to the Second World War presents the nation entirely as a victim, first of Allied aggression and then of brutal Nazi occupation after the 1943 armistice with the Allies. This earlier film, only a decade prior, does not carry the Finzi-Continis implication of Italy's complicity in its own destruction. It offers, I would argue, a myth of comfort. And while at the beginning of the film that we just watched, the garden initially seems to offer a seemingly idyllic refuge, its eventual destruction and desolation ultimately shatters such a myth of comfort, a myth of protection, a myth of refuge, the mild, the idle, I-D-Y-L-L. Moreover, the film conveys that being deceived by an illusion or willfully or helplessly misinterpreting an illusion as reality is dangerous. Truly, the world in which the Finzi-Continis and Giorgio live disposes them to believe the illusion of safety that the garden signifies. The film does not place moral implication upon the victims of the film. Giorgio's father believes they will be okay because he was a member of the Fascist Party, within which Jewish participation was not an anomaly until anti-Semitism became part of Mussolini's platform in the mid-1930s. Giorgio is kicked out of the public library, but he is very quickly able to find solace in the private library of Signor Finzi-Contini. The Finzi-Continis are able to keep their domestic servants due to their father's political donations. But as the film progresses, it becomes harder and harder to perform as though things are normal. And of course, the idyllic paradise of the garden does not provide safety. And the inability to recognize an idyllic illusion as an illusion is ultimately catastrophic. Recognition is key in the film. Giorgio is angry at his father for his unwillingness to accept the truth about fascism, while his own fascination with Nicole and the idyllic future that he hopes to build with her is simultaneously rooting him in a space where he is unable or unwilling to take the action that might be necessary to save his life, even while he recognizes the political reality more clearly than his father does. The turning point in the film comes after Nicole returns to Ferrara after taking her exams, and she has firsthand experience with the brutality of a Nazi professor. And it's then that she really begins to recognize the futility of a future for her and Giorgio, and also that she recognizes that Giorgio is clinging to an idyllic illusion of her as a romantic refuge, one that is precluding him of taking the steps to save himself. Now again, this does not mean that Giorgio does not perceive what is actually happening politically around him. Again, it is he that expresses frustration with his father, who is trying to encourage his son to act normally, trying to keep things from his brother and sister. Giorgio knows what's happening, but he's not able or not willing to do anything about it because he is bound to his attraction to Nicole. For instance, when he has safety in France and his brother Ernesto tries to convince him to stay, he says, "There is too much that I can't take with me." He is torn by his illusory idealization of Nicole. And it's only when Giorgio sees Nicole with Melnate, in a sequence during which Nicole exposes herself and Melnate's presence to him, that this illusion is broken. It is Nicole's intentional demystification of herself that ultimately saves Giorgio. The necessity of recognizing reality is emphasized in the very next scene as Giorgio returns home and his father tells him that he now realizes the error of what he has been saying, that he has believed his own fiction, and he says that it's too late for him to start over. He's made too many mistakes. My generation has made too many mistakes. The call that De Sica's film is making in 1970 to encourage a more critical interrogation of the past begins to be taken up more explicitly in the 1980s due to a couple of factors that in part would lead to more concerted and widespread attention being paid to and questions raised about the Italian experience of the Holocaust. First was an October 1982 terrorist attack on the Great Synagogue of Rome, which, in the words of Italian pedagogy professor and Italian parliamentarian Melina Santorini, says that this terrorist attack brought to light the problem of rising anti-Semitism in Italy and the importance that education can combat intolerance and discrimination. And Santorini marks that this is the moment in Italian history that can be regarded as the birth of fully fledged Holocaust education in the nation. The second pivot point in the 1980s is that Italy experienced a revival of interest in Italian Jewish history in anticipation of the 50th anniversary of when Italy would become officially an anti-Semitic state in 1938 with fascism's imposition of the racial laws. As the anniversary approached, here I'm quoting from historian Joshua Zimmerman, a new post-war generation of scholars began to reevaluate the existing sources, uncover new ones, and raise new questions. And one clear example of this scholarly shift and reinterrogation is the historian that I mentioned previously, Susan Zuccotti, who published the book The Italians and the Holocaust, 1987, so the year prior to the 50th anniversary. And in this book, she invokes the large number of Italian Jews that survived the Holocaust, but recontextualizes the numbers to ask, quote, quite the opposite question. About 15% of the Jews in Italy during the German occupation did not survive the Holocaust. This book asks how more, this is her talking about her own book, this book asks how more than 6,800 people could have been rounded up and deported to be gassed from a country that, despite its 19th century ghettos and the promptings of fascist rulers, had no significant anti-Semitic tradition. Italian Jews lived in the shadow of the Vatican, in close proximity to the moral and spiritual leader of the Catholic world and the supreme teacher of Christian precepts of brotherly love and the sanctity of human life. And the Holocaust began much later in Italy than in most other European countries, so that Jews should have been aware of the danger and quick to flee. In Rome, the danger period from September 1943 to June 1944 lasted only 9 months. In most of central Italy, it continued 3 or 4 months longer. In northern Italy, it existed until April 1945, a maximum of 20 months, yet 15% of Italy's Jews were destroyed. How could this have happened? And it's after this period that Holocaust scholarship has tended towards a more overtly focused and critical stance of Italy's experience in relation to the Holocaust. And I've just given a few examples here of this renewed attention. One example is Susan Zuccotti's later work from 2000, Under His Very Windows, The Vatican and the Holocaust. A 2005 collection of essays called Jews in Italy Under Fascist and Nazi Rule, 1922 to 1945. And in this collection, the aim of the collection is to challenge the myth of Italian benevolence toward Jews during the fascist period. There have been also more concerted reflections on Italian cinema's reckoning with Italy's history, in particular Millicent Marcus's 2007 book, Italian Film in the Shadow of Auschwitz. And just a couple of years ago, in 2016, another full-length study was published by scholar Alexis Hare on the history of the Fossoli di Carpi camp that existed under fascist Nazi and post-war Allied control. So going back to the film that we're focusing on today, The Garden of the Finzi-Continis, context in 1970, this is a time where questions are starting to be asked about what really happened during the war in different national contexts. But I think that The Garden of the Finzi-Continis goes farther than this, and through De Sica's critical use of the garden of beauty as a dangerous illusion, the film is ahead of its time insofar as it anticipates the calling into question a conception of a mild Holocaust in Italy, a reinterrogation that began to spread in the 1980s, along with explicit questions regarding what such a consensus might be distorting. With such a move towards interrogation and revelation of an intellectual historical myth as a myth, I don't think it's a coincidence that 27 years after De Sica's film, after this reinterrogation of the 1980s, we see another Italian film in which a father believes his own fiction and needs to break this illusion in order to save his son in the context of the Holocaust. In 1997, Roberto Benigni releases La Vita è Bella, Life is Beautiful, where you have a father and son imprisoned in a concentration camp, and the father, in order to protect his son, aims to pretend that their imprisonment is a game. Not dissimilar from in Finzi-Continis, when Giorgio's father initially tries to convince him that their circumstances are not that bad. And like Giorgio's father in Life is Beautiful, the father starts to believe, to some extent, his own fiction. In Benigni's film, the father buys into a hope that his family will be rescued after he befriends a Nazi doctor. But also like Finzi-Continis, later in Life is Beautiful, the father recognizes that he has been deceived by his own illusions when he discovers the doctor's interest in him is only related to his ability to talk riddles. Immediately after this discovery is the only scene in Life is Beautiful where the grotesque reality of the Holocaust is displayed for the father as he stumbles across a wall of bodies. But in this case, his son is asleep on his shoulder and thus remains oblivious. It is only after the father's own illusion is broken that there is the possibility of saving his son. And at the end of Life is Beautiful, we discover that the entire film has been from the perspective of the now grown-up child, whose view and understanding of the past was completely bound to the fable that his father aimed to construct for him. So in Life is Beautiful, again, 27 years after De Sica's film, I would argue we see an explicit manifestation as a fable of what is implicit in the beauty of the Garden of the Finzi-Continis. Both are illusions, comforting illusions that must be recognized as such. In both of these films, the illusions, the putative refuge of the beauty of the garden, the possibility that the beauty of Nicole means for Giorgio, and the beautiful innocence of the fable in Life is Beautiful, these can be read as critiquing the perception of the Holocaust in Italy as less horrific than it was, and offering a means to reflect on the consequences and danger of such an illusory view. If the past is not interrogated, if we are lulled by comforting views or myths of the past, what we are left with is a fable, a distorted view of the past that glosses over the historical record and precludes opportunities for critical reflection, dialogue, and education. We're gathered today in light of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which offers an opportunity and an obligation to ensure that we ask the hard questions and to ensure that we are not lulled into a false or fabulous conception of the past that gives comfort, but that evades or distorts the hard questions. For instance, in our Examining the Holocaust gallery on level 4, there is a film that explores the history of anti-Semitism in Canada during the 1930s and 1940s. And one of the goals of this film, one of the reasons that we created this film as part of our inaugural exhibits, was to disabuse notions of a simple and perhaps comforting but incomplete conception of Canada's relation vis-a-vis the Holocaust as only one of the Allied nations that fought against Nazi Germany, which of course it was. But this film also aims to reflect on some of the anti-Semitic social and political sentiments here at home that, among other things, contributed to our country closing its doors to the Jews of Europe that were aiming to flee. It is important to not evade the hard questions. And I think in the Garden of the Finzi-Continis, the aesthetic and narrative construction of beauty as a dangerous illusion is Vittorio De Sica's attempt to wrestle with what these hard questions can reveal about the history and the memorial legacy of the Holocaust in Italy. Thank you very much.